Welcome back. Our next guest has studied and written extensively about feminism for well-known publications, but her latest undertaking takes it to a whole new level. In her new book entitled White Feminism, she examines how many women have been shut out of the feminist movement. Joining us now is former Jezebel editor-in-chief, Koa Beck. Welcome to the show, Koa.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Koa, we're delighted to have you here today. And let's start by, I think a lot of people have thought about feminism in sort of simple terms, like, oh, a feminist is somebody who just wants the same equal rights as men. But you do a real deep dive on why it's been so problematic. So let's break down first, what do you mean when you say white feminism and why it's so troubling?
I define white feminism very early in the text to give people a working definition of, exactly what I'm talking about and also what I'm tracking. I define white feminism as a very specific ideology and approach towards achieving gender equality that pulls considerably from colonialism, imperialism, white supremacy, and also gauges quote unquote feminist wins on individual accumulation of wealth, as well as labor exploitation.
Which is very, very, fulsome in its explanation. Let's go a little further now, because how does, white feminism differ from feminism for women of color, for women with disabilities, for people in the LGBTQ2 plus community, for example?
Well, many of the movements that you just cited, a big signature of their strategies, but also their ideologies, is thinking more collectively in terms of not just women's rights, but just, social movements in general. So a lot of their strategies, whether they're gauged as feminist or not, are not anchored in, one person in their community ascending within a certain system or achieving certain rights or being visible in a certain capacity. They're thinking along the lines of rights and policies and accessibility for everyone, whether it's like food security or affordable housing or clean water, metrics like that.
Your book challenges the whole almost trendy packaging that has gone along with white feminism. I think of like the girl boss branding, the kind of lean in lingo, which, to be honest, I'm going to call us out. I think we've been guilty on this show of promoting some of those very notions. But let's talk about why that kind of feminism has been so quote unquote successful.
Well, I think that exact type of, branded white feminism that you're talking about, it doesn't ask that institutions or powerful bodies change that much. And that's because a big dimension of what you're talking about and citing is that it is branding. It is PR. It is marketing perception. To give you a personal example, I very intentionally include in the book some of my own experiences in mainstream women's media that really championed a lot of content and stories around professional women in, leadership capacities in very senior roles. And yet, despite this, image that was exported that, we supported as an editorial team, many of the women who I have worked with and, mentored in those exact newsrooms are terrified to ask for raises. So a lot of that doesn't really reflect internal policies, working conditions for the women who actually, make this content possible. And I think you can see a through line from that to many other industries where it doesn't really reflect changes or any sort of equality for the people doing the labor internally. It is branding.
Another area that you explore extensively in the book is with specifically Indigenous women in the United States and how they have been really quite turned off by the brand of feminism, and largely because it's something you alluded to also in the book is the colonial past of the United States as well, and the fact that historically many Indigenous tribes were matriarchal, in fact. So dive into that a little bit, if you will.
I do track in the book that a lot of practices that white feminism, not just exports, but also indoctrinates, for people coming to a white feminist ideology, whether they quantify it that way or not, is a lot of colonial practices. For instance, I track in my book how a lot of language that white feminism traffics in either, promoting like equal pay or, promoting an awareness of like gender discrimination or pregnancy discrimination, uses the term conquer, in that this idea that, feminism is conquering this industry, feminism is, conquering this space. And understandably, Native women and Two-Spirit people have a very complex relationship with that term. But also there's a fundamental lack of awareness there for how colonialism and patriarchy work hand in hand. And yet white feminism is willing to adopt this colonialist mindset in exporting quote unquote feminism.
The ending of your book is a kind of call to action to dismantle feminism as we know it and build up a better system. So tell us about what that new feminism could look like.
Well, I think that a pertinent question that I've gotten on the promotion for this book is, if an inclusive feminism is actually possible. And to that, I always say, in some ways it's happened already. It just hasn't happened under white feminism. A number of gender movements that I, cite through the book have worked, across race, across class, across orientation. And I draw a lot of inspiration of, where we can move as a collective body from those exact movements. And I'm very intentional about citing them. I think that one of the things that can really help us in building a movement that does think about all these different multifaceted identities is thinking more in terms of the systems that oppress us rather than, individual people or, very specific industries, that are particularly harmful, orienting more towards how systems oppress us and keep us in this very locked hierarchy is also very popular. I also think that there needs to be more literacy built on women abusing other women, and that there needs to be a more robust narrative of how that happens, but also the dynamics that facilitate that, per exactly colonialism, imperialism, and also exploiting other women through labor.
Oh, gosh. Listen, we said off the top that you've written for many prolific publications, and you actually wrote a piece in Time magazine that was examining feminism in COVID-19 and arguing that COVID-19 wasn't undoing feminism per se, but it was just revealing a lot of the issues within it. And we've talked about it extensively on this show, how this pandemic has disproportionately hit women, and certainly women of color in particular. What is that connection then for you between feminism and this pandemic through your lens?
Well, I think that a really predominant narrative that's playing out in my own country that I don't agree with is that COVID-19 is quote unquote setting back feminism. And I think that really betrays a white feminist understanding of gender progress, especially in my country, in that the place by which people are quantifying quote unquote feminism is narrowly through white collar senior leadership positions. So when you look at a lot of the data, yes, women in those, fields or dimensions are having to quit their jobs to, take over more domestic labor, especially a lot of effectively, homeschooling for children, but also losing jobs because of economic collapse. Meanwhile, a lot of women in my own country, who are domestic workers who have lost considerable amount of work, who, haven't been able to pay rent or mortgages in the last 6 months, many of whom are mothers to young children, their job losses are not being quantified as quote unquote setting back feminism. And I think that's really indicative of who we're talking about when there are mainstream narratives surrounding women's rights.
It's just so fascinating and just scratching the surface, really. Koa, this has been so enlightening. Thank you so much for joining us today. We want to remind everybody that her book, White Feminism, is available everywhere. We'll be right back after this.